2-year-old Yosef was murdered in his crib. The family maid Maria was murdered in her bed. The rest of the family, though, had been slaughtered in the family barn.
For 102 years, the Hinterkaifeck farm has been a ghost story. 6 people, one family, eliminated in the dark with a farm tool. The only clues were footprints in the snow that led to the house, but never away. It was the perfect unsolvable mystery, until now. German forensics just matched DNA from the attic floorboards to a suspect. The case is officially closed. But here's the catch. The killer's identity isn't just shocking. The motive, hidden for a century, confirms a truth so dark it makes the original crime seem tame. Forensics ends the nightmare. For 102 years, the name Hinterkaifeck meant unsolvable. It was Germany's most infamous cold case, a ghost story whispered in Bavaria about a phantom who came from the woods, eliminated an entire family of 6 with a farm tool, and then lived in their house for almost a week. It was the perfect, terrifying mystery. The police had no suspects, no motive, and no escape route. The only footprints in the snow led to the house, but none led away. The case was so cold it was frozen solid. Investigators chased ghosts. They interviewed hundreds of people. They even consulted psychics. But nothing. The trail ended in the snow of 1922. Yeah, about that, it's not unsolved anymore. In early 2024, a special cold case unit at the Bavarian State Criminal Police Office decided to gamble on a 1 in a million shot. The farm itself is long gone. It was torn down in 1923, less than a year after the event, because locals claimed it was cursed, haunted, a place of pure evil. But here's the catch. Not everything was destroyed. Hundreds of photographs, witness statements, and pieces of physical evidence were archived, locked away in a police vault. And hidden within that archive was a small, unassuming cardboard box. The label on the side? Attic floorboards. What most people don't realize is that the attic was ground zero for the mystery. It's where the family patriarch, Andreas Gruber, complained of hearing footsteps in the days before the massacre. It's where he found a strange newspaper he'd never bought. It's where the family's keys vanished. The attic, police believed, is where the killer lived, hiding, watching, and waiting. So, here's the deal. Forensic scientists, using genetic technology that sounds like pure science fiction, began a painstaking analysis of these 102-year-old pieces of wood. They weren't just looking for fingerprints. They were looking for genetic material. Using advanced mitochondrial DNA sequencing, they targeted microscopic flecks of dried blood spatter that had soaked deep into the grain of the wood over a century ago. This wasn't just any blood. It belonged to the victims, but mixed in with it, they also found blood from someone else. The crazy part is, they got a hit. It was a partial profile, degraded by time and moisture, but it was there. It was strong enough to run against modern genealogical databases. For months, it was nothing. Dead end after dead end. Then a match. A distant relative living in modern-day Germany shared a unique genetic marker. The police built a family tree backwards, spanning over a century, digging through baptismal records and census data until they landed on one name: Peter Stangesinger, a ghost, a phantom. A name that means nothing to the history books. In 1922, he was a 53-year-old drifter, a reclusive handyman who lived on the absolute fringes of society. He was, for all intents and purposes, invisible. But get this, he wasn't just a random drifter. The DNA confirmed the real secret, the secret that changes everything. Peter Stangesinger was related to the Grubers. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a random drifter looking for a warm place to sleep. This new evidence points to something far more sinister. The police didn't just find the killer, they found the motive. And it's a motive buried in a dark family secret, a story of blood debt and revenge that makes the original brutal act seem almost secondary. The truth of Hinterkaifeck is not about a monster who came from the woods, it's about the monster that was already inside the family. The case is solved, but the story is worse. So much worse than anyone ever imagined. But to understand why this one name just debunked a century of madness, you have to go back. Back to the farm, back to the family, and back to the blood in the snow. The haunting at Hinterkaifeck. Hinterkaifeck wasn't really a town, it wasn't even a village. It was just a name for a farmstead. The Kaifeck part meant it was in a hollow, and Hinter meant behind. It was the farm behind the hollow, totally isolated, remote, and tucked away in the Bavarian countryside. It was over a mile from the nearest neighbor. You couldn't see it from the road, you had to know it was there. And in March of 1922, the farm was home to 6 people. This family is the core of the entire mystery. First, there was the patriarch, Andreas Gruber. He was 63 years old and known in the surrounding villages for being stern, controlling, and just deeply unlikable. He was a man who had enemies. With him lived his wife, Cecilia, who was 72 and worn down by decades of hard farm life and a harder husband. Then there was their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, 35 years old. Victoria was at the center of the farm's darkest, most disturbing rumors. The whole village whispered about her. She had a husband, Carl Gabriel, who had supposedly perished in the trenches of World War I. But the whispers said that long after her husband was gone, Victoria had started an intimate, unnatural relationship with her own father, Andreas. Victoria had 2 children living on the farm. Her daughter, Cecilia II, was 7. Her son, Joseph, was just 2. And here's the wow factor that makes this whole thing so much darker. The entire village believed that little Joseph was the product of that forbidden relationship between Victoria and her father. The family was, to put it lightly, a powder keg of secrets and shame. The 6th person was the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, 44. And get this, Maria arrived on March 31st, 1922. It was her very first day. She was brought to the farm just hours before the horrific act. Her sister had walked with her to the farm's edge and later told police that Maria had a terrible sinking feeling. She said the farm felt cursed and haunted. She was right. For weeks, strange and terrifying things had been happening at Hinterkaifeck. Andreas, not a man known for flights of fancy, told neighbors he was spooked. He'd found a set of footprints in the fresh snow. They led from the dense forest at the edge of his property, walked right up to the barn, and stopped. He spent hours circling his own home, looking for a second set of footprints, the ones leading away. He never found them. It was as if the person had simply vanished into the air or walked inside. A few days later, he started hearing noises, footsteps, creaks, and whispers coming from the attic. He'd grab his pitchfork, climb the ladder, and find nothing. He'd go back downstairs and the noises would start all over again. Then, things got bolder. A strange newspaper from Munich appeared on his porch, one he had never subscribed to. A few days after that, one of the main house keys vanished. This all happened right after the family's previous maid had quit suddenly. She had fled the farm, claiming it was cursed, that she heard voices, and that she felt a presence. So here's the deal. On the night of March 31st, someone or something was waiting. The police timeline, pieced together from the autopsies, is chilling. The killer didn't just burst in through the front door. They were patient. They knew the routine. It's believed they waited in the barn, hiding in the hayloft, making just enough noise to draw the family out one by one. First, they lured Victoria, then her elderly mother, Cecilia, then the patriarch, Andreas, and finally, little 7-year-old Cecilia one by one as they entered the barn to check on the livestock. They were met with a mattock, a heavy pickaxe-like farm tool. They were dispatched quickly, their skulls shattered, their bodies were then stacked in the hay, covered up. But the killer wasn't done. They left the barn, covered in the evidence of their act, and walked back to the main house. Inside were 2 people, completely unaware of what had just happened. The new maid, Maria, in her bedroom, and 2-year-old Joseph asleep in his crib in Victoria's room. The killer went to Maria's room first and ended her life in her bed. Finally, they went to the nursery and eliminated the toddler. The farm went silent. And now the craziest part of all. The part that turned this from a simple crime into a legend. The killer didn't flee, they didn't run, they stayed. For the next 4 days, the person responsible for this absolute horror lived at Hinterkaifeck. Neighbors who hadn't seen the family at Sunday church grew worried. On April 4th, they formed a small search party. They walked onto the property. The first thing they noticed was the cattle, lowing and restless. But they'd been fed, they'd even been milked. The farm dog was tied up but seemed fine. Inside the house, they found a meal half-eaten on the kitchen table. Smoke was still rising from the chimney. Someone had kept the fire going. Then they checked the bedrooms, finding the horrific scenes with Maria and Joseph. Finally, they went to the barn, and there, buried in the hay, they found the rest of the family. The police were called, but the scene was a total mess. The search party had walked everywhere, contaminating any evidence. But even then, the core mystery was clear. Who does this? Who eliminates an entire family and then stays? Who feeds the cows, eats their food, and sleeps in their beds, surrounded by the evidence of what they'd done? It wasn't a robbery. Money and valuables were left untouched. It wasn't a simple act of rage. It was too calculated, too patient. It was basically an execution. The footprints in the snow finally made sense. The killer hadn't vanished. They had just walked inside and waited. The police had a scene of impossible horror, and the hunt for the Phantom of Hinterkaifeck began the failed investigation. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck massacre was, to put it lightly, a complete and total disaster from the second it started. We're talking about 1922. Forensic science as we know it didn't exist. The concept of securing a crime scene was pretty much unheard of. By the time the Munich Police Department arrived, dozens of neighbors, family members, and just plain old curiosity seekers had walked through the house, the barn, and all over the property. They had touched the bodies. They had moved evidence. And most importantly, they had touched the murder weapon, the mattock, which was found leaning against a wall, wiped clean of any prints. The police were basically chasing shadows. They interviewed over 100 suspects, from drifters to army deserters to jealous neighbors. But the investigation kept circling back to two main theories. Two men who had every reason to want the Grubers gone. The first and most popular suspect was the neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Schlittenbauer was complicated. He was a prominent figure in the local village, and he had been in an intimate long-term relationship with Victoria. In fact, he claimed he was the father of little Joseph, not Andreas. He had even signed the birth certificate. This gave him a powerful motive: rage, jealousy, and a bitter dispute over child support payments. And get this, his behavior on the day the bodies were found was beyond weird. Schlittenbauer was part of that original search party. He was one of the first inside the house and the first inside the barn. When he saw the scene, his first act wasn't to run and call the police. He moved the bodies around. He was seen lifting the hay off them, supposedly looking for his son. He also knew the farm like the back of his hand. He could have easily navigated it in the dark. And here's a wow factor. He was the one who found the house key, the one Andreas had reported missing, supposedly on the barn door. Later, he was the one who locked the barn, securing the crime scene, but also perhaps securing his own secrets. For decades, the village whispered that it was him. Rumors even spread that on his deathbed, years later, he confessed to a priest. But here's the catch. There was zero physical evidence. Nothing. It was all just village gossip and a very, very strong motive. Then there was the second theory, the phantom theory. This one centered on Victoria's husband, Karl Gabriel. Karl had supposedly perished in the trenches of World War I 8 years earlier in 1914. His body was never recovered, but that wasn't uncommon in the brutal trench warfare. The rumor, though, was that Karl hadn't passed away, that he'd been taken as a prisoner of war in Russia and had returned to Germany under a new name, only to find his home changed. What most people don't realize is that some of his fellow soldiers swore they saw him after his supposed demise. They claimed he was alive and well. If Karl Gabriel was alive, his motive was crystal clear. He returns home after years of war, a ghost, to find his wife had a child, Joseph, with another man. And not just any man, but possibly her own father, Andreas. The shame and rage would be unimaginable. This theory explained the killer's cold, military-like precision. It explained the ability to live off the land, to hide in the attic like a soldier in a foxhole, and to vanish. The killer was a ghost, because he was a ghost, a man who was supposed to be gone. The police chased this lead for years. They tried to find records of Karl Gabriel in Russia. They followed leads from soldiers, but nothing. So, here's the deal. The case went completely cold. It became a national obsession, a what-if story that terrified Germany, and the authorities got desperate. This is the absolute strangest and most disturbing wow factor of the entire case. With no leads, the investigators decided on a radical last-ditch effort. In 1923, they removed the heads of all 6 victims. Yes, you read that right. The bodies were buried, but the heads were sent to a clairvoyant in Munich. The hope was that these psychics could hold the skulls and get a vision of the killer, a psychic clue. It didn't work. And to make it all worse, the heads were never returned. They were stored in a university archive, and during the chaos of World War II, they were either destroyed in an Allied bombing raid or simply lost. The 6 victims of Hinterkaifeck lay for decades in a cemetery, headless. The farm itself was torn down a year after the event. Locals couldn't stand the sight of it. They said it was a place of pure evil. The land was plowed over. The trees grew back. And for 102 years, the story ended right there, a perfect, horrifying mystery. A family eliminated by a phantom, their heads lost to a war, and their story turning from true crime into pure folklore, but the police were just chasing the normal theories. The ones floating around town were much, much weirder. A political hit squad. When the official investigation failed, the public imagination took over, and the wild theories that came out of the darkness were frankly insane. But in a case with no answers, every theory seemed possible. The first and most persistent was the occult theory. Think about it. The new maid, Maria, said the house felt haunted just hours before she was dispatched. The previous maid fled, claiming she heard voices. The killer stacked the bodies in the barn in a way that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. The mattock was wiped clean. This wasn't just rage, this was ceremony. What most people don't realize is that post-World War I Germany, especially Bavaria, was a hotbed for fringe beliefs and occult groups. Groups like the Thule Society were mixing bizarre folk magic with extreme politics right in Munich. People were desperate for answers, and they were looking in dark places. What if Hinterkaifeck wasn't a farm? What if it was a thin place, a spot on some ancient ley line? Maybe Andreas, known for being greedy, had found something he shouldn't have while digging on his property, an ancient relic, a cursed object. And then there are the heads. The official story is that the police took them for psychics. But the wild theory? The killer took them. That the heads were a trophy, a final piece of a dark ritual. The police, embarrassed and baffled, invented the psychic story to cover up the even more terrifying truth. It sounds crazy, but in a case with headless victims and one-way footprints, ritual felt to some like the only answer. Then there was the political theory. This one is just as wild, but in a different way. So here's the deal. 1922 Bavaria was chaos. It was the heart of hyperinflation, political unrest, and simmering violence. The short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic had been crushed just a few years earlier. And all over the countryside, far-right militias, the Freikorps, were acting as judge, jury, and executioner. What if Andreas Gruber wasn't just a farmer? What if he was a political player? The theory goes that Andreas was either a communist informant or he was hoarding weapons for one of these militias. He was known to be secretive and rich. Maybe he was a bagman. This theory suggests the killer wasn't a killer, it was a squad, a professional hit team. This explains the military precision, it explains the calculated one-by-one execution, it explains the ability to hide in the attic unseen, that's standard military tradecraft. And the 4 days they stayed? They weren't living, they were searching. They were tearing the farm apart, floorboard by floorboard, looking for documents, lists of names, or a hidden stash of gold or weapons. They fed the cattle simply to keep the farm looking normal for a few days, to give themselves a bigger head start. The family wasn't the target. The secret in the farmhouse was. But even that theory wasn't the weirdest. The craziest one? The wild man theory. The farm was remote. The woods were deep. The footprints only led from the woods. What if it wasn't a man? Locals in that part of Bavaria had stories, Wolfsmensch legends. A wild man of the woods, an outcast who lived like an animal. This theory, as bizarre as it sounds, actually explains a lot. It explains the superhuman animalistic brutality of the Matic. It explains the lack of a human motive like robbery or jealousy. It explains the one-way footprints. A creature of the woods wouldn't use a path. It would climb a tree or move in a way a human wouldn't, and feeding the cattle? This, to the theorists, was the biggest clue. A human killer might flee, but an animal, a wild man, he would see the cattle as fellow creatures and his animal instinct would be to care for them. It sounds like a monster movie, but after 100 years of no answers, the monster theory started to look just as good as any other. Occultists, hit squads, even monsters. The theories were insane, but the truth, locked in a single drop of blood, was even wilder. The DNA solves it all. So here's the deal. It wasn't an occult ritual, it wasn't a political hit squad, and it wasn't a monster from the woods. The police chased Lauren Schlittenbauer, they chased the ghost of Carl Gabriel. For 100 years, everyone was obsessed with them. But the DNA in the attic floorboards points to none of them. It points to a name nobody ever considered: Peter Stangassinger. So, who was he? The 2024 cold case team didn't just get his name, they started digging. And they found him, mentioned just once in the old police files. He was questioned briefly in 1922. He was dismissed as a harmless eccentric. Basically, he was the local bogeyman. He was 53 years old. He wasn't a neighbor. He was a drifter, a handyman who did odd jobs for food, but mostly kept to himself in a small shack deep in the woods, miles from Hinterkaifeck. He was a man people saw but never knew. He was known for his frightening intensity. Children were told to run if they saw him. He was rumored to dabble in old-world folk magic, but worse, he was whispered about for having unnatural family relationships of his own. He was a total outcast, shunned by the church and ignored by the law. He was the perfect person to vanish. He had no real connections, no one to report him missing. He was, in every sense, a ghost long before he ever stepped foot on the farm. But here's the catch. The DNA test didn't just say who he was, it explained why he was there. This is the part that's worse than anyone imagined. Peter Stangassinger was not a stranger. The genealogical DNA trace proved without a doubt that he shared a direct paternal bloodline with Andreas Gruber. He was family. The most likely theory, pieced together by historians and the cold case unit, is that Peter Stangassinger was Andreas Gruber's illegitimate son, born decades earlier from an affair Andreas had and then abandoned. He was the secret son, the blood that was cast out. Left to rot in poverty and shame while Andreas built his farm and his family, Stangassinger wasn't a drifter who stumbled on the farm. He was a son coming home. Think about it. This new information explains everything the police couldn't. The footprints in the snow that only led to the house? That was Stangassinger arriving. He didn't need to leave because he was planning to stay. The sounds in the attic? The lost keys? The strange newspaper? Stangassinger wasn't just visiting. He was living in the attic for days, maybe even weeks, before the horrific act. He was the predator inside the house. He was watching the family, listening to them, learning their routines. He saw the father who had abandoned him living with his proper family. He saw the rumors, the dysfunction, and he waited. And the most chilling part? The killer staying for 4 days after the event. Why? Because in his twisted mind, the farm was his. He wasn't a stranger defiling a home. He was the rightful heir, taking possession. He fed the cattle because they were his cattle. He ate the food because it was his food. He smoked Andreas's tobacco. He slept in his bed. He was simply living in the house he believed he was owed. The final, horrifying piece of evidence came not from the DNA, but from the crime scene photos. When the 2024 team re-examined the high-resolution images of the attic, they found something everyone had missed for a century. Scratched into the soot on a wooden beam, right near where the blood spatters were found, were 2 words in old German script. Blutschuld. It means blood debt. This was never about money. It was never about a random impulse. This was a reckoning. This was a man, broken by the world and abandoned by his father, coming to collect a debt he felt he was owed. He couldn't have the life, the name, or the farm. So he decided to erase the family that did. He was the family's dark secret, coming out of the woods to claim his inheritance in blood. It was never a ghost story. It was a family tragedy, from the first footprint to the final horrific act. The phantom had a face, and it was a face that looked just like Andreas Gruber. It was always family. So here's the deal. The mystery of Hinterkaifeck is over. 102 years of speculation gone. All the wild theories, the occult, the hit squads, the monsters were just shadows on the wall. The real monster was all too human. The case is closed. The phantom has a name, Peter Stangassinger, the son who never was. The thing is, this revelation just changes the whole story from a whodunit to something sadder and way more disturbing. What most people don't realize is that this confirms the darkest truth of all. The real monsters aren't the ones that come from the woods. They're the ones we create, the ones we abandon. Stangassinger was a product of Andreas Gruber's own secrets. He was the consequence. He hid in the attic for weeks, a living, breathing symbol of the family's dysfunction. He watched them, and in the end, he acted. He used a simple farm tool, a mattock, to end the family line and take his place in the house. The DNA confirms he was there. The blood debt message confirms his motive, and his presence explains every bizarre detail, from the one-way footprints to the well-fed cattle. The Phantom of Hinterkaifeck wasn't a phantom at all. He was just a man who should have been family, and that's by far the most terrifying part of this whole story. So what do you think? After 102 years, is this justice? Or did this DNA discovery just prove that some family secrets are better left buried? Let us know in the comments, and make sure to like and subscribe.